These guys we're after, these aren't just street thugs.
I know that.
I just wanted to say, be careful, you know?
There are many examples of franchises that got cut short just as they were about to make their next generation debut. Things don't always go as planned, and for one reason or another, not every series can survive that transitional period. Fear Effect would be an unfortunate example of this type of situation, initially springing up with two great games which came out a year apart at the tail end of the PlayStation 1's lifespan. Both were sci-fi horror games that mixed action and stealth elements with fixed camera environments filled with challenging puzzles. I've already put out a video on what made those games so good, so check that out if you want more context. But as the series gained momentum, its third entry, Fear Effect Inferno, was set to follow soon after, taking advantage of the massive technological leap granted by the PlayStation 2. While the first two have very similar mechanics and presentation styles, this new one was revamping its controls by leaning into and streamlining its action elements, as well as experimenting with fully 3D arenas for some encounters. Not only that, but it looked to be pushing the envelope even further with its content, going for an even darker storyline full of surreal and graphic visuals that would have taken us through hell and back. The series was created and developed entirely by Kronos Digital Entertainment, with Eidos publishing each one of the games. Kronos actually retained the rights to the Fear Effect IP, but late into the third game's development, Eidos pulled out of the project, with journalists citing a newly implemented quality control assurance program as the justification. Eidos had either determined the project didn't meet its updated quality standards, or was taking too long to complete. With that, Kronos had the opportunity to find a new publisher for the game, which was really far along in development, but were unsuccessful in finding funding, going out of business sometime around 2004. Inferno had gotten fans excited when it was shown at E3 in 2002, but those intriguing visuals and concepts that showed so much promise were left to linger in their minds for decades as the title never saw the light of day. What made things worse is that you'd assume whoever ended up getting the rights to the series afterwards would have tried to move things forward, but for some reason the Fear Effect brand has remained virtually untouched ever since. Outside of a smaller scale indie developed sequel from 2018, and an attempted remake of the first game that got passed around to different developers before getting cancelled as well. Out of nowhere in 2024, a beta of the game from April 2003 was released to the public, letting us get closer than we're ever going to get to experiencing the incredible vision the team at Kronos had. We'll be playing this on an actual PlayStation 2 to create the most authentic view of what the game would have looked like. Surprisingly, huge chunks of the game are playable without issue, with tons of cutscenes included, giving us a taste of the game's tone and ambition. This beta is archived on a site called Sega Dreamcast Info, which specializes in creating articles based on unreleased games like this. According to them, Sega was one of the companies Kronos attempted to pitch Inferno to after Eidos stepped away, but they didn't make a deal. Alongside the beta itself, they've managed to compile hundreds of scripts, storyboards, and pieces of concept art from the game's development, that do in fact take us from start to finish with the game's narrative. I reached out to the site's owner, who confirms the authenticity of these documents, and even let me know that there exists an additional prototype from 2 months earlier with its own peculiarities, which he plans on releasing sometime in 2025. Make sure to check out their page on this game to see how they break down all of the game's materials in detail, and to give credit to all of those involved in getting this thing playable. We're not going to laboriously go through every single storyboard or line of the script, but I will highlight the most interesting story beats, characters, locations, and newly introduced mechanics. I want to create a clear picture of how the narrative was meant to flow and where this journey would have taken us. Of course, this beta is from an unreleased game that was a work in progress, so it contains placeholder images in several places which would have been replaced later in development, and many scenes are missing voice acting or just missing completely. But we'll fill in the blanks with what was planned as those gaps pop up. The game was going to take place a few years after the first, following the true ending you could get from beating it on hard. This means Deke was revived survived after being impaled through the eye, Glass got his arm back after it was cut off, and we'd also get to see how Rain would fit into the dynamic of the team since she was introduced in the second game, which was a prequel to the first. There were gonna be 4 main levels, starting with the lavish mansion of a wealthy triad boss named Minx. This guy owns Hannah's contract, giving him control over her life, and even though she's earned enough money to buy her freedom, he refuses to let her go. So she decides that the only way for her to escape is to assassinate him with her team. It's a very Mission Impossible 1 style opening, which will make even more sense by the end of the chapter. Deke and Rain are already undercover in the mansion, posing as employees. Deke has been operating in the shadows while playing the role of the mansion's chef, while Rain is dressed in a revealing bodysuit, blending in with the other members of the boss's harem. Both of them are setting things up in the mansion so that Hannah and Glass can infiltrate from the sky. The series is known for switching perspectives between playable characters throughout a level, but this would have been the first time you'd embody an enemy for a one-off sequence. After an elaborate opening cutscene establishing the setting, this guard is who you start the game as. He's suspicious of Deke since the camera in the kitchen isn't functioning properly. We're also shown this guard has fingerprint access and knows the code to the mansion's armory full of guns. Deke decides to eliminate him, first throwing a cleaver, hiding, and then bursting out of the pantry to ambush him. He drags the guard to the counter and chops his hand clean off, so that he can use it later to gain access to the armory. This first moment is cool because you see one of the protagonists from an outside perspective. We as fans recognize him and know how unhinged he is, but the guard doesn't and quickly comes to learn that fact. Deke gets him to reveal the pin code too, but before he can execute him, other guards come to the rescue. This is your first chance to play around in one of the game's newly introduced 3D battle spaces. These were introduced later into development, so most of them have pre-rendered alternatives that can still be viewed in this beta. So I'll make sure to show off both versions just to highlight how the game was evolving throughout its production. A lot of these pre-rendered variants look extremely dark and moody, and overall the backgrounds in this game are a step above what we saw in the first two. With the increased resolution of the PlayStation 2 and the capacity of the DVDs the console used, we're treated to environments that are much more densely detailed with more frames of animation that loop more smoothly. With Inferno, the tank controls featured in the first 2 games were dropped, so movement feels the same whether you're exploring a 3D space or an environment made up of pre-rendered backgrounds. But this does introduce the issue I discussed in my Blue Stinger video, regarding games with fixed cameras that don't use tank controls, where your movement can get awkward when transitioning from one camera angle to the next, because the direction you're going and which way you're holding the analog stick is based on the orientation of the previous angle, until you let go and let the controls reset to the new view. This change in control type does make sense because this game is aiming to be much more action focused than the first 2. But what's interesting is that even though it puts an emphasis on streamlined and free-flowing combat, its story content and the designs and locations featured within it are actually even more nightmarish than the first 2, so I find this to be an easy trade-off to accept. With the enemies dealt with, Deke transmits the handprint and codes to Hannah and Glass, who are standing by in an aircraft high above the mansion. Now it's up to Rain to disable the compound's security system. She makes her way through a room full of other members of the Triad leader's harem, narrowly escaping a couple of them who invite her to join in on the fun. By exploring the environment, you find a key to the kennel where they keep the watchdogs. She enters and gets spotted by one of the guards and attempts to seduce him. But when that doesn't work, she lures him in and knocks him across the room with a single kick. You're then free to knock him around however you feel like, getting his security card as a reward. After flirting with Hannah over the radio, she leaves, but the camera stays behind as a pit bull walks up to the door, transforming into the shape of a human. We only see the shadow of its final form, but we're now aware that they're not holding back on introducing the supernatural elements this time around. And as we proceed, you'll see that they had no intention of slowing down on this type of thing, aiming to deliver the most hallucinatory and oppressive experience from the series yet. I want to take a moment to compliment the art design of this whole mansion, featuring a surprisingly organic, semi-aquatic theme. Instead of having us move through sterile, metal hallways, this place is extremely colorful, with plant life sprouting out everywhere. The grass specifically is rendered in an appealing old-school way. Everywhere you look, there are strips of lights radiating in striking ways. There's a library, dining rooms, several rooms with comfy beds, pools, and showers. stores, which really sell that, first and foremost, this is a luxury home for Minx to enjoy himself, surrounded by beautiful women. But moving on, Rain makes her way to the security room, which is filled with several more guards. This time, she lures them away by claiming the other girls are looking for company. They all take off running out of the room, but one of them unfortunately needs to stay behind. Once he turns around, Rain pulls out one of her hairpins, intending to stab him, but he catches a glimpse of her in the reflection of his monitor, triggering another fight. Rain doesn't have any ammo for her weapons by default in this demo, so you're best to rely on the melee combat system in the game. In the previous entries, melee weapons had to be equipped individually and were best for silent stealth kills. Inferno really expands on this concept, giving you dedicated buttons for punching and kicking, which flow into different combos depending on the order of your inputs. You also have a dedicated grab button that lets you hold an enemy and give them a few gut punches, or knock them into the air where you can actually start juggling them. In an effort to keep you flowing between your melee and projectile options, you can knock guns out of enemies' hands, forcing them to duke it out with you, which I think is a neat layer of believability. Of course, a melee attack while sneaking around will automatically trigger a stealth kill, and downed enemies can also be finished off with a special execution animation. Since you're in disguise, it's to your benefit to avoid attacking anyone to remain hidden. Otherwise, everyone, including the ladies, will start trying to take you out. Instead of holding a button to enter a sneaking posture, the intensity of your movement is determined simply by how far you're tilting the analog stick. You have a dedicated face button for rolling that you can use in any direction. It ends up feeling a little different than the previous games because you don't need to commit to the direction you're facing the same way you used to. Before we talk about the gunplay, let's move forward in the level. In order to disarm the mansion's security system, Rain asks for help translating the Chinese numbers on display and entering that code into a terminal. This allows Hannah and Glass to begin their infiltration from the sky. Glass tells her to stay safe, a sentiment that she initially blows off, but then rests her head on his shoulder and connects his parachute, letting him know the feeling is mutual. They're setting up a love triangle here, with Hannah having feelings for both Glass and Rain. They play around with this concept in a few interesting ways, but we'll go into detail with that as it becomes more relevant.
If I didn't know better, I'd say you were jealous.
I'd be more jealous of Deke's inflator mate.
Hey, leave me girlfriend out of this.
All right, we all know our jobs. Let's go.
The two of them skydive down to the facility, while Deke heads out to disable the lift associated with the mansion's helicopter landing zone. Minx is scheduled to land there shortly, and by disabling the lift, he'll be trapped there with nowhere to escape to, making him easy to ambush. Deke makes his way to the armory to load up on weapons using the guard's severed hand for access, and from there enters an aquarium-themed lounge. Guards start attacking him when he begins messing with a control panel, but after sweeping them aside, he enters the same access code into a unique water pressure mechanism, which opens a hidden entrance to the lift's control room. With that taken care of, Hannah and Glass, who have landed within the compound, finally begin their portion of the mission. Hannah heads through a garage towards the helipad while Glass makes his way into the sewers, and begins planting explosives in preparation to detonate the entire mansion upon their exit. Both of them run into resistance, but they're packing more weapons than Rain was. Instead of cycling through your inventory and selecting which gun you want to use, you can now hotkey two of them to their own face buttons, meaning at any time you can instantaneously switch between them as you see fit during combat. You could run and gun in the first two games, but now when you're shooting, you enter this semi-mobile posture, where your movements are translated into really smooth dodges and dives depending on the direction you're holding. The different characters all have unique animations while moving like this, and they change depending on which weapon you're using too. These add a degree of characterization to each member of the team with how their animations reflect their personality. Rain is really light on her feet, doing flips like a ballerina, while Hannah goes full Hong Kong action film, shooting in two different directions at once or with one pistol behind her back. These, alongside the melee combos, make it clear how much they wanted to make this entry more of a fast-paced, stylish action game compared to what came before. And while I'm not quite sure what the practical use is for these animations, they obviously look sick. It's hard to tell if each one of these movements is intended to grant you invincibility frames, or perhaps they were meant to tie into a meter that was yet to be implemented, which would give you temporary invulnerability similar to the dodge mechanic from Yakuza 0's Rush style. To keep up with the action, ammo automatically gets pulled into your character instead of needing to be picked up individually. You'll also automatically vault over waist-high walls that are placed throughout these 3D combat areas. Certain objects are destructible, adding to the hectic energy of shootouts. You'll also have several opportunities to knock enemies over ledges and down to their deaths, taking advantage of the verticality of levels to a greater extent than before. Rain lets everyone know that Minx's helicopter is about to land. Inside, we see him having a conversation with Jin, which fans of the original would know is not a good sign. Originally presented as an ally and informant in the first game, and by extension its prequel, Retro Helix, he was later revealed to be the game's main antagonist, Yim Lao Wang, the King of Hell in disguise, manipulating events for his benefit. Since Inferno actually takes place after we bested him at the end of 1, he can only be here to screw us over somehow. He informs Minx of the impending assassination attempt so that it can be avoided. And to everyone's surprise, the lift is still functional, even though it should have been disabled by Deke. Hannah lines up a shot with her sniper rifle, but right as she fires, he's protected by his large robotic bodyguard. The bullet deflects off his metallic skin and they escape into the mansion. The plan is falling apart, but Hannah can still kill Minx if she chases after him. Right after, she snipes the helicopter pilot in the head for good measure. In a bit of an awkward sequence, the bodyguard reappears, tosses Hannah through the air, and then just walks away. But it does knock out her earpiece, cutting her off from the rest of the team. With the explosives planted in the sewers, Glass makes his way back to the surface and traces Hannah's footsteps in an attempt to meet back up with her. In doing so, he discovers the helipad elevator is still operational and confronts Deke over it. Deke reassures him he disabled it himself, but Glass cuts the argument short so that they can lock in and find Hannah. Rain chimes in and says she's gonna look around too, but gets caught by a couple of guards who are gathering up all of the women now that the mansion is on high alert. Glass begins operating the helicopter Minx landed in, hoping to get the team a ride out of there. Meanwhile, Hannah enters the mansion's library hoping to locate Minx, but gets ambushed by his men who are lying in wait. They lock the door behind her, and after a gunfight, the cyborg bodyguard drops through the skylight for a boss fight. A lot of the boss fights in this beta are pretty unfinished, but this one has a lot going for it even in its early state. He's covered in a protective barrier, but when he attacks, he leaves himself open for attack. Aside from charging punches, he's also able to throw around pieces of the environment, including entire bookshelves, and launch a trail of electricity at you. Once defeated, he picks Hannah up and tosses her through a window down into a pool below. Glass continues to defend his evacuation point as 2 enemy helicopters close in on his position. He destroys one, but his aircraft takes a critical hit, meaning he has to defend against the remaining helicopter on foot. As it drops troops down to fight you, you'll need to ignite the gas lines of the helipad to burn it out of the sky. Now, this is where the beta's playable content starts to fall apart. Deke leaves the aquarium's secret vault only to find a bunch of enemies waiting for him. One launches a rocket at him, which he dodges, but the explosion causes the entire room to flood and then drain itself. The idea was that you'd need to climb to safety to avoid a shark swimming around in the water, which you'd then drop a chandelier onto. Deke and Glass would then continue their search for Hannah as Rain is lined up with the other members of Minx's harem. Apparently, he personally picks one of them to join him once a night. Rain avoids drawing attention to herself and is relieved when he picks a different girl and begins walking away, only to stop and call her out by name. He already saw through her disguise and his guards apprehend her, taking her to join Hannah, who they've already captured as well. The 2 guys still have their freedom and continue tearing up the mansion looking for the ladies. Eventually, Glass saves Deke from being held up by guards, and the 2 of them make their way down into the depths of the compound through an elevator shaft. Deke goes first and almost shoots Glass when he steps out himself, cluing you further into the tension between them. Makes you wonder if Deke did it on purpose, with ulterior motives, or still remembers and holds resentment over the boss fight you had with him in Hell in the first game. Hannah is strapped into some kind of metallic chair, unconscious, with Minx pointing a pistol right against her back. Rain is held to the side by a guard with a gun pointed at her as well, keeping her from helping. It's a standoff, but Glass pulls out a detonator and threatens to set off the explosives he planted in the sewers, which would kill them all. Minx tells him he might as well do it, because there's no way he's getting out of this room alive anyway. Deke gets antsy and goes to open fire, but as soon as he moves, Minx shoots Hannah with the bullet exploding out of her chest, leaving no question in our minds about her status. Everyone starts shooting, and Rain uses the chaos to break free of her captor and release Hannah from the chair while she's still breathing. Hannah snaps awake and uses one of the dropped guns to shoot Minx right through the forehead in slow motion, before passing out again. Glass then has round 2 with the cyborg bodyguard, which plays out the same as it did with Hannah aside from the change in scenery. Everyone is knocked out besides Rain, who stands up with a blank expression on her face. Her eyes suddenly turn white and she begins floating in the air, glowing with mystical energy, which bursts out of her and consumes the entire room. We know from playing Retro Helix that Rain has supernatural origins. Birthed alongside a twin sister from an archaeologist who gained divine power after injecting herself with the DNA of an immortal Chinese emperor that she excavated the tomb of. Yeah, it's a long story, but she battles against her evil twin sister Mist at the end of the game, who takes them to another dimension and fuses with their mother who exists there. This could be an attempt to expand on the implications of Rain's powers, which could bring some added spice to the world of Fear Effect. When she wakes up, the cyborg bodyguard has been defeated, and Glass urges her to her feet, then picks up Hannah's body. Deke tells the rest of them to get out of there while he holds off the guards, feeling the need to make up for screwing things up, keeping the detonator on hand for the right moment. The other 3 make their escape, procuring a limo from the garage and speeding off like a bat out of hell as the building explodes behind them. Inside the vehicle, Hannah is hanging on by a thread, held in Rain's arms. She has a disc on her, and in the first example of a branching narrative within the game, you as the player actually get to decide whether she gives it to Rain or Glass, choosing which of them is more important to her. There's a cutscene for each where she speaks some words of encouragement to them and then passes away, bringing the mansion chapter of the game to a close. This is what I was alluding to when I compared this first chapter to the first Mission Impossible. Everyone is going through the motions, but something goes wrong, getting people killed and throwing a wrench in everyone's lives moving forward. Just a thought, but I feel like even if Deke is redeemed later in the game, this opening mission would cause him to become hated by most players. I'm just thinking of other characters who have had a hard time coming back from leaving bad first impressions, which would have been sad to see since everyone likes him in the first game. I'd also like to note how in some of the shots in this limo scene, you can see that Rain's design is slightly different. You can see the original design more clearly in concept art and early promotional images for the game. Her dress was somehow even more revealing, and while I'm not complaining about her final design, I do think the original looked better and a bit more conceptual than a simple skin-tight leotard with a banner just kinda pasted on the front and back. Along the same line, in those early promo shots, Hannah's shirt was actually a blue leotard that went down into her pants. This would have been another design element tying the series to IDOS and Tomb Raider, since Lara Croft also wore a leotard in her original games. Most people don't even realize this was a thing, due to the low resolution textures, the CGI renders not including it, alongside the several reboots moving away from it. But I'm a big fan of that aspect of her design, so I would have loved for Hannah to rock that look herself. After that first mission, the game goes off the rails, ramping up the surreal psychological horror elements. While the mansion featured a lot of perspective shifting between characters having shootouts, this next chapter set in a hospital focuses on Hannah alone, fighting for her life with melee weapons where it's reality itself shifting around her. One second she's lying there dying in the limo, and the next she's flying through the mountains in a chariot being pulled by a winged creature. Flower petals falling from the sky like snow with a bullet hole still in her chest. This dream fades away to reveal she's in a hospital bed, being looked at by an extremely busty nurse with a strange looking face mask. Just like in the first chapter where you started off as a guard, this time you begin as that nurse, who looks over a medical log which lists 4 arcane symbols on it. As the nurse, you make your way around the hospital hallways full of other equally well-endowed nurses, to find a syringe that you bring back and inject into Hannah against her will. This sends her back into that dream. This time she's sitting upright in her hospital gown. From one of the flowers that lands emerges Wei Ming, who we haven't seen since the ending of the first game. In the best ending, she's revealed to be a creation of Yim Lao, meant to create a hell on Earth to avoid hell itself becoming any more overcrowded with souls. But with Hannah and Glass teaming up, they're able to defeat Yim Lao and liberate Wei Ming, who vows to never forget them and repays their efforts by reviving Deke and returning Glass's severed arm. So when she shows up here next to Hannah, it's a sign of relief. She just smiles and passes Hannah a bowl of liquid that reflects her image and then begins boiling up. Hannah drops it and it ignites the carriage they're both sitting in, but Wei Ming has no reaction to it. Suddenly, the environment around them turns apocalyptic, with exploding volcanoes and rivers of running lava. The bird pulling them is now lit up like a phoenix, and Wei Ming herself begins to burn, but just continues to smile like nothing's happening. The fire spreads to Hannah as she attempts to snap her out of her trance, but then begins falling into the hellscape below. Some sort of force catches her before she hits the ground, but she finds herself in the middle of an empty funeral venue. She gets up and immediately notices the bull-headed figures standing at each corner of the room. They raise their weapons and start moving in on her position, but she immediately leaps up and swipes a sword off the casket in the center of the room. This is called the Tao Sword, which seems to be made up of rings or coins, and she uses it to fight off these new enemies without hesitation. In gameplay, they're represented by zombies, which could either mean they were intended to have their designs changed or the final enemies represented in the cutscenes weren't finished yet. With the dog transforming into a man earlier in the game, this wouldn't be far off thematically. She continues fending them off in the following cutscene, before one throws a spear straight through her chest, which causes her to wake up in the hospital bed again with a syringe being stabbed into her chest in the same position. I want to draw attention to how much they've elevated the cutscene choreography compared to the first two games. You see more of this moving forward, but there's something about the motion blur used in these scenes that makes them look really good. After being injected, Hannah sees those same symbols from the clipboard materialize on her forearm, but the nurse leaves before she can ask her any questions. She looks out the window to see the snowy mountains are still there, but the question of where she even is still lingers. She's free to explore the hospital herself, eventually finding a note that states that she's been admitted to surgery. Interestingly, none of the nurses here will fight back even if you attack them. They'll just put their hands up to block. Speaking of them, they're one of those elements that makes the tone of these games hard to pin down, especially for people on the outside looking in. I should be afraid of my current situation, but how can I be when there are these skimpy nurses all around? Given Hannah's sexuality, I'm sure she wouldn't be complaining under normal circumstances either. But their inclusion could be a way to lull Hannah into a false sense of security, making her less resistant to what she's being put through, which also applies to us as the player. From a monitor, she spots a guy in a suit sitting in the waiting room, which cuts to static when he notices her watching, so she goes to talk to him. He claims she's been here before and refuses to answer her when she asks where exactly she is. After even more cryptic advice, he stands up, towering above her before leaving. She chases after the guy since he might have answers, but he's already gone. Instead, she sees the same symbols on her arm begin to etch themselves into the wall, with blood eventually dripping out of them. Hannah's arm is struck with pain and she falls to the floor, passing out as the camera rolls into the ground and back to square one, where Hannah wakes up once again in her hospital bed, visibly disappointed. She sets out to find what these symbols are all about, stumbling upon a piece of medical equipment that shifts into some sort of alien technology. This thing feels like something you'd see in a Cronenberg film like Existenz. It scans her arm and reveals the shapes again. Then you have to do a puzzle where you form each one of the shapes from a series of smaller ones. After you succeed, the scanner sprouts blades, stabs itself into her arm, and begins burning the shapes into her skin. This is just an insane concept, and forces you to lean into taking pain to progress, rather than damage being the result of a fail state. After it's finished, some larger, brutish enemies enter the area which are openly hostile towards you. You'll have to take them out, and one specifically drops a key to the medical observation room. You head in there and witness a doctor and a nurse assistant performing performing a bizarre procedure on a patient. The doctor is sewing his eyes shut, and we see his mouth is sewn shut as well. The nurse stabs him with a needle that sucks a green liquid out of his body. She then presses another button and a black liquid begins heading in the opposite direction, entering his body and mutating him into what the script calls an animal fetus. This could be related to the same type of experimentation we saw in the intro of Retro Helix, but we don't know what the goals are in this context. When Hannah reacts in shock, they notice her and she takes off running, spotting Wei Ming once again in an elevator before more brutes arrive to capture her. Hannah continues to pursue Wei Ming looking for answers, which leads her into the operating room she was previously looking down into. The doctor welcomes her, and his helpers restrain her to the operating table. He claims she has the wrong eyes and they need to be removed, and as a spike gets closer and closer to her eyes, we suddenly cut to Hannah once again in her hospital bed. But this time the environment is darker and totally run down, almost like we jumped into the distant future after a terrible event. When she tries to leave, the hallway around her warps and extends beyond her so that she can never make it to the elevator. She finds another clipboard stating the operation on her was a success and isn't sure what that means, but she uses the associated timecode to set the 3 clocks around the area, allowing her to move down the hallway. Just as she's making progress, brutes come out of the elevator and restrain her on the floor. As she attempts to resist, she rips the mask off of one of them, which rips their entire face off, exposing their demonic visage underneath. They inject her with an anesthetic, knocking her out, and when she wakes up, she finds herself in a padded cell in a straitjacket. This thing seems to be restraining more than just her arms, but she gets up and catches a glimpse of the other patients being held there. You can actually run around in this outfit, which changes your normal melee attacks to revolve around shoulder shoves and kicks. She finds a metal door and immediately slams herself into it, dislocating her shoulder and allowing her to slide out of the jacket. She then slams into the door again to relocate it, and grabs a knife sticking out of the wall to use against the enemies who are headed in to stop her. What I like about this chapter is how out of her element Hannah is, yet in the face of all of it, her resolve is unwavering and she remains completely determined to escape and get back to her team. This time, an enemy drops a key to the orderly room, which you enter to see a nurse working at a console. She's no longer wearing a mask, but turns around to reveal her face is also missing skin, with the bloody flesh underneath exposed and sunken holes where her eyes should be. Unlike the guys, she also has a long tongue sticking out, which she uses in combat like a whip. You'll have to contend with a bunch of enemies while exploring the maze of padded rooms to find a pair of pliers, which you can then use in a maintenance area to bypass a circuit breaker to get the elevator working. As the elevator violently shakes into motion, she's knocked to the floor. When she opens her eyes, the elevator is moving with the door open, showing her descending past a horrific wall of flesh. The walls begin to close in on her from both sides, and as she tries to hold them back, they twist into gore as well, with her hands burying into them. She looks up to see one of the many corpses going by is actually Rain's, which drives Hannah into a panic, unsure if this is real or some sort of premonition. She's able to silence these visions and snap back to reality, where she enters the same funeral area from her dream at the start of the chapter. She obtains the Tau sword off the casket again as well, using it to fight off any incoming zombies she sees. You push a few caskets out of the way to proceed deeper into the level, and you can stumble upon an actual Easter egg, which I'm sure would have been changed to something cooler in the final game. This next hallway is really atmospheric with the flickering candle lights and low-angled camera. The design of these areas and how they connect together don't seem to make any sense, because why did that hall lead into what looks like a metal vent of some sort, which pops open to reveal that she was inside one of the refrigeration units of a morgue. As enemies pile into this destroyed environment, you'll need to move these autopsy tables, but why this is the solution remains unclear. A casket flies out into the middle of the room, which she's shocked to see has her own name and date of death listed on it. Interesting to see she was born in 2024, the same year this beta was finally released to the public. She opens it and sees that it's empty, but the doctor from before pops up behind her and pushes her in, shutting the lid over her. This is where there's a big difference between how the beta is formatted and how the script lays things out. Here, we would have cut to the visual parallel of the other characters attending Hannah's actual funeral. From inside the coffin, Hannah would have kicked the lid open to find herself looking up at the others from her position 6 feet under. She tries to get their attention and escape, but they can't see her and don't react. Eventually, she'd get out of the pit to witness Rain and Glass consoling each other over their shared loss. She'd then see her own gravestone, causing her to step back in shock, falling back into the coffin where the ground itself would break open and crumble into darkness. She would then find herself back in the coffin in the hospital, using the experience she had as motivation to punch straight through the casket, exploding out in a flip and landing on her feet. I'm gonna assume they intended to put the cemetery scene in here but weren't able to finish it, so the way it plays out in the beta is a little strange, where she gets thrown into the casket and then immediately jumps back in from off screen, almost like she teleported. She's in disbelief that what she saw was real, but the doctor assures her it was, revealing that she's been in hell this whole time. In the storyboard and script, they wanted him to hurl a scalpel at her, slicing her neck open, but that doesn't happen in the cutscene, and the two of them just prepare for battle. I'm not sure if this is just a placeholder, but he has a shield made up of zombie heads which looks pretty goofy, but he isn't very noteworthy otherwise. After you drain his health, he takes off running into a door made of tentacles, which Hannah gets pulled into as well. This room is far more hellish, being made up of living flesh, where breasts start raining blood down onto her from above, covering her hospital gown. The doctor's brain breaks through his skull as he mutates into a grotesque new form, with mismatched body parts stitched together. But none of this phases her, appearing even more determined than before.
I don't mind the blood, especially if it's yours.
This fight takes place in a large arena as zombies pour in. This is probably one of the best examples of one of the fully 3D environments living up to the pre-rendered ones, since there are plenty of moving details like ghastly faces peppering the walls. It's all a bit campy, though I will say some of the pre-rendered backgrounds that I believe were related to this fight are more unnerving. The boss constantly regenerates his health, so you need to make it around the room and destroy his hanging machines. Once you do, tentacles zoom out and rip Hannah out the door, throwing her back out into the area full of padded rooms. Still covered in blood, she needs to fight her way back to the boss, this time slicing her way through in an impressive display.
My turn to play doctor.
Hannah is a total badass in this chapter, even though the things she's facing are so much more wild and disgusting than what she's seen before. She proceeds to lay the smackdown on the boss now that he can't regain his health, but his attack pattern is very unorthodox. Obviously, this boss would have likely been expanded upon by the final game, but even though he's so huge, all he can do is rip out his organs and show them to you, which lets you do damage to him. Now, is he attracting the zombies with his organs like bait? He was likely gonna be able to do a lot more in between these animations, like different sweeps and area of effect attacks. Maybe he'd even hold out a bomb or something, tricking you into hitting it, making you pay more attention. Comedy aside, this fight is so unfinished that I don't think you can actually beat it, though the following final cutscene of the chapter is finished and can be skipped to in the menu. The doctor tells her she belongs here in hell and that he can't be defeated, but Hannah asks if he wants to bet on that, striking him in the brain, causing a chain reaction that blows him up, opening a gateway behind him. As she runs through, her clothes mysteriously transform into rags, but before we can see where she's headed, we rejoin the other characters for the third chapter of the game. While the first two levels were missing pieces, you could basically make it through them from start to finish and get the general idea they were going for. If you squint hard enough, you can imagine you're playing the real game, especially with how many cinematics are finished chaining things together. It's with Chapter 3 that things start to break down. There are still plenty of cutscenes, but it's hard to make sense of how they connect together with the areas you can actually play through. But just like the other two, this level has its own sense of identity, coming at things with a unique atmosphere, visuals, and horror concepts. For this one, we'll have to lean more heavily into the scripts and storyboards to link these ideas together. I think it was a smart idea for the hospital chapter to include a scene with the other characters, making it feel more natural to then lead into a chapter focusing on them instead. Without that scene, the pacing would feel a little weird like it does in this beta. Since we go from a chapter with everyone together, then one only focusing on an isolated Hannah, and then halfway through the game finally pick back up with the other characters finally reacting reacting to the events of that first chapter. So we cut back to the real world where once again Glass and Rain are attending Hannah's funeral. They're both extremely torn up over her death, and Rain buries her head in Glass's shoulder, who comforts her back. We didn't see this before, but Deke is also there, watching from behind a tree in the distance. Clearly blaming himself for what happened, he actually leaves a bloodied handprint where he was digging his fingers into the bark before leaving. Depending on who you gave the disc to earlier in the game, you would have gotten a different scene where that person watches its contents. For Rain, she's sitting in her bed in her lingerie, while a storm's blowing rain against the windows of her apartment. She looks to a framed picture of Hannah before playing the disc, which contains a recording she made before the last mission. She says that she's taking care of everything for Rain so that she won't have to worry about her finances moving forward, and that she loves her before the recording ends. In the alternative scene with Glass, we see him binge drinking in his car. He decides to watch the video she gave him, where she says that she prepared a package for him, but left her estate to Rain and that she wants him to take care of her. She just says she'll miss him instead of that she loves him like she did in Rain's video. So it seems like her preference for Rain is preserved no matter who you chose to give the disc to earlier. After those optional scenes, we'd find Rain tossing and turning while trying to sleep, when Glass would come to visit her. They'd share some wine together while reminiscing about Hannah. Then Rain would get angry and try to blame the others for letting her get herself killed, knowing how dangerous it was. Glass says they threatened to hurt Rain to get at Hannah, and that she wasn't gonna let that happen, needing to take extreme measures. Now, blaming herself, she'd cry and head to the bathroom where she would punch and shatter the mirror in anger. Glass would hear the glass break and run to check on her, and the two would share a charged moment together, which Glass pulls away from, saying he should leave. As Rain covers her hand in a towel, she tells him he doesn't have to go. But you as the player get the choice to decide whether he stays or not. If you stay, he'll join her on the bed and they'll begin to embrace before it fades to black, with the script even directly stating they're going for the Terminator 1 love scene. If you choose to leave, she'll come over to hug Glass, telling him she'll be okay, and he makes his departure. Later that night, Rain would once again have trouble sleeping. She'd jolt awake from a nightmare, and after examining her photo of Hannah, she'd notice her own pearl ring. This pearl was given to Hannah by the immortal emperor I mentioned before, who Rain and her sister were created from when their mother injected herself with his DNA. So he's basically Rain's father, and Hannah passed it on to her, having it turned into a ring between games. She heads to the bathroom sink and washes her face, and your attention is likely drawn to the fact that this is another scene with that older art style, like the one in the limo from before. This is much more in line with the rendering style of the first two games, just a little more detailed, and I actually prefer this look considerably. I find this hard, two-tone shading style to be much more pleasant. They stand out from the background in a much more interesting way like this. My theory is that they were making the game with this style originally, and then went back to update and change previous scenes. Of course, not being able to get to everything down the line as development was halted. That's why you're gonna notice far more art style and design inconsistencies in the footage as we get closer to the end. Rain hears something moving in her apartment behind her and she goes to investigate. In the corner of her room, a demonic form of Hannah is sitting, which would have gripped her arm, burning her with its icy touch. It would force her to her knees and tell her to come save her by entering the gate to hell located in Shanxi. This was a location from the first game where the brothel level took place. There, you descended into hell for the final level, and at the end of the true ending, the entire area was demolished, but apparently the gate still exists. Turns out Rain was having a nightmare, but her arm is still burned from the monster's grip, meaning there must be some truth to the information it was giving her. She calls Glass, who has the same burns on his arm as well. She wants him to take her to Shanxi, but he refuses, not wanting to go back to the misery he experienced there. She threatens to go by herself, but wanting to protect her, he agrees to go with her. He then calls Deke for support, who simply watches the phone ring while continuing to drink and smoke, the same mark on his arm as the other two. All three of them were visited by a demonic form resembling Hannah, who told them to go to Shanxi, with only Rain not knowing how bad it was to lose an arm and actually die like Glass and Deke do. We then get a scene with Glass the next day where he's preparing to leave when a new character, his ex-girlfriend Niall, shows up at the door. She wants to be with him, but he says she lost that chance. They decide to make love one more time before he leaves, with her telling him not to go to Shanxi, stating that the shadowy agency she works for knows he's looking for some kind of key. He leaves anyway, determined to make things right by Hannah. After he leaves, she grabs a communicator and tells her agency to proceed as planned, while touching her belly, I suppose implying she's gonna have his kid? We cut to Glass's vehicle driving through Shanxi, where we would have gotten a good look at the now dilapidated state of this town. Rain would be in the passenger seat with neither of them knowing if Deke was gonna show up. Turns out he'd be there, but watching from a distance, still drinking even now. Glass parks and the two of them get out, with Rain staring down a chasm with spirits swirling around the bottom of it. Some of those spirits fly up and try to attack her, but her ring lights up and deflects them. Then, before she can react, another group of spirits burst from the ground and knock her off the edge, sending her falling down below. Glass isn't able to catch her, then turns around to see a human-shaped smoke cloud appearing behind him, unfazed by his bullets. A piece of the script must be missing here because the next thing we have is Glass pulling a rocket launcher out of his trunk. He moves into the level and reaches a barrier that the spirits can't go through. Some spirits were supposed to be attacking this statue, causing it to fall and block a doorway. Later on, he'd come across a zombie who would vomit all over him, then begin attacking. A short battle against these floating zombies and spirits would ensue, but they aren't much trouble because all they can really do is randomly fly at you. Glass thinks he's done, but more zombies descend on him, and he can't fire fast enough, eventually getting knocked out, with the camera panning away as spirits enter and possess his body. As you can see, since they were still molding this level at an early stage, Glass's design varies greatly from scene to scene, along with other things not lining up, like what was up with that rocket launcher he never uses. According to the script and storyboard, they'd enter through his mouth, which would have made this transition out of Rain's mouth to show her current location even cooler. She wakes up in the depths of the ruins, where we get some more dark and moody backgrounds. She's supposed to be unarmed and eventually gets attacked by a spirit who possesses a dead body, but her ring once again comes to save her, blowing its head off. In line with how each level has played a little differently up to this point, it could have been cool to only have this ring as your weapon, which could shoot bursts of energy. After tumbling deeper into the underground and warding off a few more spirits, she was gonna do a flying kick to this door to get through it, which would have knocked a few tons of rocks down onto her, but the ring automatically creates a protective barrier which deflects the rocks. This thing is quite the asset to have in place of a gun here. This shot looking down at this makeshift bridge is a little unsettling. She comes to this wide industrial pit with a catwalk around its perimeter. When she looks over the edge, a giant stream of spirits would fly out and begin chasing her down the structure. You can explore this area, but none of that story-related stuff is integrated into the beta. When you get to the end of the line, Rain would have looked back to see countless spirits and zombies about to get her, forcing her to jump over the edge into a swirling vortex of green spiritual energy. This takes her to this room made of giant wooden rollers, which was one of the final puzzle rooms you needed to overcome to get to the finale of the first Fear Effect. Conceptually, it was one of the most memorable and surreal moments in that game, so it's interesting to see it return. This time, I believe you have to match the symbols to the ones on the floor, which would have caused energy to activate a platform in the middle of the room, raising Rain up into a portal. This would take her to the same area where the end of the first game took place, with the same chair and mirror Yimlao sat at, this time with an added table too. It's cool to see Rain interact with elements of the first game, because it kinda legitimizes her as part of the series, and not just something added into a prequel. She gets attacked by more spirits which knock her unconscious, with her ring rolling off her finger as well. Then we'd cut to Deke finally making progress into the city, drinking and popping more pills along the way. He'd find himself heading in the direction of the brothel from the first game, so delirious that for a moment he sees it in its original functioning condition, but snaps back to reality to see it destroyed. There was a funny bit planned here where Deke would run from some zombies into a banquet hall, grabbing a chair to brace a door shut, but as he stood there proud of himself, a pillar he agitated by moving the chair would crash down and destroy the entire door anyway, with him making a quip about that being Australian for doorstop. This lets more spirits enter the room to possess more corpses, and after defeating them, he looks up to see Glass standing on a balcony above him. Glass doesn't respond to anything Deke says, then fires off a stream or two of vomit at him, revealing that he was possessed after that fight he had with that group of zombies earlier. I am extremely surprised to see that this possessed form of Glass is actually in the beta, with him floating around vomiting on you and his hair standing straight up. This is sorta like the opposite of what Glass experienced in the first game, where he needed to fight against Deke in hell. I think the intended sequence of events would have led Deke to run through the same area Glass had seen earlier with the barrier that kept out spirits. By chasing Deke through there, it would have exorcised the spirits from Glass's body, freeing him from their control. Deke keeps running, but finds himself at the front door of the brothel, once again in perfect condition, and this time, it doesn't return to being destroyed. He takes off again because it's the last place he wants to be, but falls into the basement of the establishment. He'd make it to the main floor where it would also appear in a non-destroyed state, like Deke remembered it years ago before the incident. This chapter is cool because it hasn't just been a repeat of the brothel, but included a lot of the outside area we never got to see. And of course, seeing things destroyed gives it its own feel. So when they start playing with callbacks, it contrasts in an interesting way. He'd start getting toyed with by a group of prostitutes who would lure him deeper into the building, preying on his delirious state. Then, Madam Chen, a villain from the first game, would appear before him in human form, causing the environment to shift back into its rundown state and the women to reveal themselves as demons. She used to run this place and just so happens to be the one who slit his throat and threw him out of a window into a spike. He's died before and was even killed again in hell, and she preys on that trauma, claiming he isn't meant for the living world. Deke coming back to life at the end of the first game was played for laughs, but here they take the effects of that way more seriously, flashing back to Deke alone in his apartment, slicing his own wrists to try to feel alive. A scene which unfortunately doesn't have any storyboards to go along with the script. He'd snap out of this and begin shooting at her, but she'd disappear, and he'd find himself teleported to the door of her office, which is where he was previously killed. In the script, she'd toss her own head at him before mutating into her demonic form we're familiar with from the first game. Then the walls would be covered in heads, some of which would be his teammates. This would have likely led to a boss fight, remnants of which still exist in the beta. Her arena and model is there, but she doesn't have any attacks or anything. She just rotates around with you, with some bull heads floating around her. I'm gonna assume these heads are just placeholders for the heads of the other characters they intended to use as described in the storyboard, which she would have then used as projectiles or for defense. It's at least cool to see her rendered in full 3D, since she was one of those bosses that was pre-rendered into the background in the original. After you win, the room would return to normal, but she'd do a repeat of the first game and toss Deke out the window again. Once more, he'd be impaled through the eye with a spike, but this time it would snap off and miraculously he'd still be alive, this thing sticking out the back of his head. Demons close in on him, along with the sound of Hannah's voice off screen telling him he's the one who killed her. So he'd begin freaking out. This chapter effectively plays on your memories of the first game, but continuously subverts your expectations. The spike is included on his character model as you explore the area, eventually coming to a torture room with a grindstone, where Madam Chen pushes Deke into it, sparks flying off the spike in his head as he tries to fight her off, but gets pushed closer and closer. Right before his face makes contact, we cut to him freaking out alone, without the spike in his head. He explores further, finding his way to the same changing room Hannah used in the first game. There, he'd find the key to the freezer, continuing to be haunted by faint whispers and the voice of Madam Chen telling him Hannah is waiting for him in hell. When he enters the meat locker, all of the meat that was once frozen would be hanging there decomposed. He'd soon realize the whispers were coming from the meat, now turned into human corpses, all victims he previously killed. They ask if he remembers them, including the charred remains of a girl who had been burned alive in a car crash as the result of one of his missions. hands. She would ignite into flames while speaking as the other corpses continue to approach, their vengeful cries growing louder. These storyboards still have the spike sticking out of his eye, so they were probably still working on the sequence of events. He eventually manages to escape through a door to the butcher's room where blinding light is emitting, a transition that leads nicely into a shot of the sky which Glass is staring up at, finally waking up from his possession. Glass explores the environment, knocking over a pillar to get up to the balcony his possessed form jumped down from. Then he jumps across a large gap to enter a window to the brothel. When his foot hits the ground, the whole place transforms back to how it looked years ago. Surprised, he cautiously makes his way further in, entering a lounge where he hears a drip. Just like before, he sees his own arm has been sliced clean off, with demon prostitutes moving in to finish the job. Both characters are being forced to relive their darkest moments once again. Knowing his body was hung to bleed out in the freezer, he naturally heads there too. Unlike earlier, the freezer would be in working condition, and he'd see himself hanging there, missing an arm just like he was now. He falls to his knees and grabs his arm, but finds that it's returned back to reality along with him, where the locker is in its decayed state. He too enters the butcher's room, where the portal to hell has been left all these years. He sees Deke cowering in the corner, driven insane from the drugs, alcohol, trauma, and reminders of his sins all attacking his brain at once. There's also a giant spike literally attacking his brain, which the script does describe as inducing physical pain, despite not killing him. Glass doesn't realize they saw each other earlier, but Deke just sees Glass in his possessed form from earlier, freaking out even more and pushing him across the room. The storyboard says go to gameplay, so I'm gonna assume we'd have a boss fight against Glass here. The shoe is on the other foot for Glass, who doesn't remember attacking Deke earlier, but is now being strangled by an out-of-control Deke. He breaks free and throws Deke back, but he holds on, pulling them both down into the gateway to hell, where they fall onto a platform floating a sizable distance from where we left Rain passed out on the floor. Deke is knocked out from the impact, but Glass would be sent over the edge, grabbing onto something revealed to be a mass of human bodies that make up the platform's base. He calls out for Rain, who wakes up and looks for a way to help them, but then notices a corpse crawling up the side of her platform. She attempts to use her ring, but now notices it's missing. I'm gonna guess you'd then need to run and find it to take the enemy out. For some reason, the table that was there before is now depicted as being knocked onto its side, so she lifts it upright, then places a ruby from the floor into the middle of it, which creates a flame. Glass accosts her from afar, and they banter back and forth. This seems like one of those moments where you start using all of the items in your inventory to see what happens, because you'd need to sacrifice Rain's photo of Hannah by using it on the fire, causing the mirror to display her gravestone. Using the information on the gravestone, you'd then need to complete an unidentified puzzle by sitting at the table, which would begin to swirl with energy. Somehow this causes the two platforms to come together, with Deke waking up and pulling Glass up before he's crushed. Based on the pre-rendered backgrounds made for this area, it seems like Deke and Glass were both gonna be hanging off the edge, so maybe they were still trying to figure out what worked better for the scene. Deke has come back to his senses, and the spike is no longer sticking out of his head. They all meet back up in what feels like an eternity, with Rain hugging Glass for obvious reasons, then surprisingly hugging Deke as well, who timidly returns the gesture, not used to this level of affection and unsure of whether he deserves it. They all gather around the mirror as the reflection begins to change, and according to the script, this is where the Shanxi level ends and the next one begins. While there are a lot of locations created for this chapter of the game, there isn't a single cutscene finished for it, but I'll try to convey where these events would take place as best as possible. The three of them question what to do now, with Deke suggesting they get the hell out of there. Rain says she isn't leaving without Hannah, and Glass tells him there's nowhere to go except walk in circles. They continue to fight, almost shooting each other even though one had just saved the other. Rain is messing with the mirror when a black figure comes out with a pure white shadow, which splits off and becomes its own form. These two contrasting reapers tell them they need to die in order to make it through the mirror. They find a paper doll and burn it, which summons Wei Ming out of the mirror. There was an interesting mechanic in the first game where you'd get paper guns and ammo which you needed to burn to get the real thing, and this follows that concept. In one of the bad endings, Wei Ming was turned into a paper doll, so I guess that happened again here. She tries to tell them to leave and that her father, Yim Lao, has taken Hannah for unknown reasons. Rain reiterates she isn't leaving without her, this being the first time she's come into contact with many of these characters and concepts. For a moment, the guys feel like backing out, but Rain's determination inspires them to get their heads back in the game. If they insist, Wei Ming tells them they need to break a talisman, separating their souls from their bodies to proceed. Rain agrees, snapping it in half, convulsing, and then falling over lifeless. The other half of the talisman disappears, and Deke reluctantly steps up to do the same, snapping his in half with his teeth. They all agreed Glass should stay behind to watch their bodies, while Wei Ming and the souls of Rain and Deke enter the mirror together. Wei Ming arrives at the destination alone, with Yim Lao stepping into view and revealing he separated the others from her, and that she did exactly as he'd hoped by bringing them here. There's something called the Chair of Judgment in this room, an obelisk with multiple seats built into its base and a head at the top. But for now, Yim Lao keeps Wei Ming distracted by summoning the demonic form of her false father, Lamb, that we saw transform at the end of the first game, who is also flanked by the two Reapers from earlier. We catch up with Deke, who got spirited away to a casino in this foreign land. He's also in rags, commenting on the fact that he's missing his shoes. He sees a woman with a wad of cash sticking out of her purse, so of course he goes to steal it. I suppose you would have been able to succeed or fail this moment, since storyboards exist for both outcomes. One where you get $1,000 from her purse, and another where you get thrown out into the streets by two of the guards. This would be our first real look at the City of the Dead, the main location for this fourth chapter. This place isn't what you'd expect from Hell, blending our own capitalistic society with horror-tinged sci-fi elements, resulting in a fascinating combination. So many of these areas are bustling with undead beings and talking animals like monkeys and pigs, having a good time playing games and partying. I especially want to note all of the bug-like vehicles flying through the air and the tentacles coming out of the water at the docks. These locations truly take advantage of the pre-rendered backgrounds, creating a world where everything is warping and twisting for no discernible reason. It's just that alien of a setting to us that doesn't need to follow our rules, where death and violence are casually integrated into everyday life. I appreciate this fortune teller whose sign asks whether their customer's fate lies in the Great Hell or Great Hell, almost poking fun at the series' own ill-defined mythology. Deke enters a pawn shop and confusingly sees the two Reapers working there too. Since he's now unarmed, they offer to sell him 2 small shotguns in return for the other half of his talisman, which he needs to get out of Hell. He's rightfully apprehensive, but they say he can buy it back at a later point, so he reluctantly agrees to make the trade. After a bit of gambling at the casino, he'd return to get the talisman, but get enticed into buying a rigged deck of cards to cheat with instead. I believe how much you continued to gamble would have been up to you, since there are a bunch of interactions planned here for different weapons and items you could end up buying with the money you made, including again a literal Easter egg. One item is perfume that he takes with him to the brothel they have here in Hell. It's a maximalist version of the brothel we made our way through above ground, with gold statues of women adorning every square foot of the place, making it come across as a church dedicated to the female form. After sleeping with one of the prostitutes there, she offers to help him cheat at the casino, likely doing some sort of sexy dance to distract the talking monkey working as the dealer. This is all starting to seem like a really weird side quest, but this is going somewhere. After he sleeps with her one more time, he steals a VIP card from her on his way out and uses that alongside the perfume he bought at the pawn shop to get access to one of the VIP rooms at the brothel. He's led there, but the woman he's set up with appears to be Hannah, who begins blaming him for being so useless that she ended up dead and working here in Hell. She starts wildly attacking him, which he eventually stops by choking her to death. This is definitely a sudden tonal shift from the fun he was having at the casino and pawn shop. Madam Chen appears again, likely running this place just like the brothel above ground, and fabricating the situation just to torment him further. She tells him to go to the judgment hall to end his suffering, just as he's attacked by more women sharing Hannah's appearance. He goes to get his talisman back from the pawn shop, but apparently apparently it won't let him leave because his soul wants to be in hell. He needs to find absolution at the Judgment Hall as Madame Chen suggests, but he'll need a mallet from the pawn shop to summon the ferryman to cross the river to get there. He doesn't care anymore, tossing the talisman back on the table and taking the mallet in exchange before heading out. After solving a puzzle to summon the ferryman, they tell him the toll is based on how many sins you've committed, and that he'll need 4 million if he wants to cross. He heads back to the casino to see the lady he teamed up with earlier, who's pissed he broke their deal, sending guards after him who throw him through a neon sign, knocking him out. At this point, even the script is starting to fall apart, with discussion points asking why things are happening so they can get fleshed out in the future. Somehow, Deke wakes up in a room of the casino and tries to leave, only for the same lady to kick the door open and slice his throat. At the same time, the storyboards seem to portray him fighting the guards and being surrounded by a mob of people who start to beat him. Yim Lao would be watching this happening while also keeping an eye on what Rain was up to. Her journey has been ill-defined in these materials, with random bits showing her in different locations or phasing through gates, with the implication of gameplay sections featuring her in between. It's hard to make sense of the sequencing, which the developers were likely figuring out themselves, but we can see the pre-rendered backgrounds for these areas she would go to, which look really cool, with giant mouths for doors and their tongues for walkways, which endless lines of undead are walking along. I guess in contrast to Deke dicking around, Rain has been making her way to her destination, solving puzzles and navigating through hazards. Yim Lao continues to watch her when Rain's evil twin sister Mist enters the scene, commenting on her progress. I feel like Mist didn't get much time to shine in Retro Helix since she operated in the shadows, to preserve the fact that she was a twin and not just an evil Rain until it was revealed at the very end. The idea of both games' antagonists teaming up is a fun concept that would have been interesting to see play out on screen. When we cut back to Deke, he's dying in an alleyway with his neck slit when this small pig girl finds and heals him. I guess the idea was that you could keep coming back to her to get your life restored as you found a way to make more money. These materials detail several scenes where Deke robs a lady for her bank card, then goes to rob the bank itself, resulting in a massive shootout. After he kills the teller, his shirt disappears for some reason, but he ends up stealing $10 million. In a pretty funny scene, the ferryman tells him his fee is now $8 million after his recent killing spree, and then $9 million after Deke complains, stating that complaining isn't a sin, but it should be. Deke then sinks his boat, but an identical ferryman floats to the dock and tells him the fee is now $10 million, which just so happens to be how much Deke robbed from the bank. That pig girl is actually pre-rendered into one of the backgrounds you would have seen after being taken across the river, and she helps Deke once again by healing him. In order to get into the Judgment Hall, he needs to bargain with this pigman who decides who gets to go through. He says that he'll grant him entry if he can find his daughter and bring her back to him. Deke agrees and locates her, which I'm sure would have taken some time considering how densely detailed this world is. When he spots her, it's actually a pretty heartbreaking scene where she tells him she doesn't want to return because her dad is a bad man. Even though she was the only one to help him in this world without asking for anything in return, he still betrays her, taking her back to her dad where she's thrown into a cage that lowers off screen. The script knows how cruel this moment is, with her even saying that she thought he was good, with Deke responding that he's full of surprises. Only way I can justify this is by considering that he doesn't care about the denizens of hell and is gonna do anything necessary to get to the Judgment Hall. His pants disappear after he does this, his disappearing clothes possibly correlating with moments where he commits immoral acts. The pig grants him access to the Judgment Hall where Yim Lao is waiting for him, calling him out for causing pain to everyone around him. He indicates that sitting in the chair of judgment will release him from his guilt. Deke agrees, with the chair locking him in place and making him remember every wrongdoing he's committed in the game. We switch back to Glass, still watching over their bodies, when enemies in stealth camo phase into view around him and attack. After a sudden shootout, he examines their bodies and realizes they work for the organization his ex-girlfriend Niall was referring to earlier. That's when she appears and saves him from another commando, stating that they're after the talismans. Glass makes an offhanded comment about wishing he was in there helping them, and she gives him that chance, suddenly shooting him in the face. As he dies, he breaks his talisman and gets sent to hell with the others. It's unclear if this was a betrayal from Niall, as she collects all 3 of their talismans, but that becomes obvious as she offers them to Mist, who was waiting for her in the mirror's reflection. Glass's soul is teleported into hell, where he appears dressed in rags like the others. He notices the same guy Hannah saw in the hospital, who he acts like he's met before. I'm gonna assume during that missing scene earlier in Shang-Chi, that shadowy figure would have been this guy who would have spoken to him. These materials refer to him as the Black Reaper, but it also refers to the Twin Reapers from elsewhere as the Black and White Reapers. Their designs and goals seem to be totally different too, with this guy giving Glass a weapon to protect himself and telling him to find an old adversary. Advice that leads him to an opulent tower owned by Lamb. He would have used a crystal key and a hidden lock located in a giant mural of the Lamb headquarters building on Earth from the first game. Inside would be a crystallized environment, where he'd find Wei Ming suspended in a large crystal in the middle of the room. This would have led to a boss fight against Lamb, which would be somewhat personal for Glass considering Lamb was the guy who chopped off his arm originally. Lamb would have shown some kind of ability to transform items into crystals, which he'd use to destroy Glass's weapons. I'm not sure what the strategy for beating him would have been, but eventually Wei Ming would attack Lamb with a burst of energy, instructing Glass to grab a sapphire from his body, which would then free her and get them out of the building. She tells him to go to the Judgment Hall to stop Yim Lao while she tries to find Hannah, and doesn't stick around long enough for Glass to ask which way he's supposed to be going. Eventually, Glass would make it there himself, finding Deke knocked out in the Chair of Judgment with Rain and Hannah sitting alongside him. Rain tells him to hurry up and sit down because this is their way out of hell. He's initially apprehensive but quickly joins them, getting locked into place. Rain then stands up, revealing herself to be Mist, who just tricked him into trapping himself. Who he thought was Hannah is actually another demonic clone of her like Deke was facing earlier. Yim Lao appears and dismisses both the clone and Mist, revealing to Glass that he orchestrated Hannah's death at the beginning of the game, alongside the nightmares they had of Hannah and the marks on their arms that spurred them on to come here. He states Deke was the easiest to manipulate due to his greed, hatred, and guilt, but he acknowledges Rain as a demigod among mortals, who should be more difficult to capture. As he forces Glass into a trance like Deke, we cut to Rain exploring the city. To her surprise, she comes across Mist and Hannah on the docks. Mist claims she wants to make up for her wrongdoings in the past and help Hannah escape hell before Yim Lao finds out. She claims she needs their father's pearl, the ring Rain has been using to protect herself up to this point, to get Hannah out since she doesn't have a talisman. She says she can use the pearl to open a portal at the Judgment Hall, but before Rain can give it to her, Wei Ming comes into view, running down the dock, blasting energy. Hannah transforms into a demon while Rain isn't looking, but gets hit alongside Mist. Thinking she's protecting Hannah, Rain fires back, almost killing Wei Ming, only to find herself surrounded by more demonic versions of Hannah. You would have had to fight them all, and once they were gone, Rain would check in on Wei Ming, who she now knows was on her side. Panicked and apologetic, Rain would try to get help for Wei Ming, but she'd be urged to stop Yim Lao at the Judgment Hall. Wei Ming would then pass away in Rain's arms, as Mist would get back up and attempt to attack them with an energy blast. Rain's ring would block and then reflect it back at her, but she'd disappear right before getting hit. Rain would make her way across the river, shocking the ferryman after he senses how pure her soul is and letting her cross for free. When she makes it to the gate with the pigman, he says they've been expecting her and attempts to attack her with a blast of electricity. She reflects it with her ring and he ends up shocking himself to death, with the undead standing in line looking annoyed that she just fried the guy who lets people through. But hey, at least the pig girl's evil dad she was afraid of is dead. There's two sequences detailed here where she tries to open the gate gate with the power of her ring and fails, and one where she succeeds. So I'm not sure if you needed to do something to get more power before you could open it all the way. I know a lot of this is just describing a sequence of story beats, but I'm trying to illustrate how they still intended for there to be plenty of playable sequences in between all of these moments. Entering the Judgment Hall, Mist stands between her and her teammates. When Rain fires a blast at her, Yim Lao appears and absorbs the shot and then welcomes her, saying she would have made her father proud. He then betrays Mist, launching her into the Chair of Judgment, trapping her with the others. He says he doesn't have the power to manipulate anyone's fate and that her friends chose to sit down themselves. He didn't force them, just twisted the circumstances that led them to make that choice out of their own free will. This distinction is hard to wrap your head around, especially after he just launched Mist into the chair himself. But perhaps the fact she was killed in the second game and is here in hell naturally means the same rules don't apply to her anymore. He says he couldn't even release her friends from the chair if he wanted to, due to these limitations on his power. The only way to save them is for Rain to sit alongside them and see what happens. But he tells her she has all of eternity to make a decision. Eventually she agrees, sitting down, but instead of putting her in a trance, it becomes agitated, throwing her off and attacking. We would have had a boss fight with the living chair and its sharp spider-like legs. After fending it off for a while, we'd cut to the real Hannah for the first time since she beat the doctor boss in the hospital. She's wandering through the city when she comes across Wei Ming's body at the docks. She's distraught seeing her old friend dead, but the Reapers appear before her, telling her to use her eyes to save her. Her eyes, which now have the ability to change fate, flare up with a blinding light as they undo Wei Ming's death. She springs back to life, happy to see her, stating that Yim Lao had long ago mentioned that a mortal would one day change the rules of the universe. I'm glad Wei Ming didn't die for good, because a single blast would have been a really lame way to go out. They acknowledge that this is what the operation at the hospital was intended to achieve. Yim Lao ordered them to remove her eyes and enhance them, letting her see the truth, which is why the hospital looked so different afterwards. Wei Ming catches her up on everything else, telling her where her friends are, how they came to save her, and how this is all a trap from Yim Lao. Continuing to be a badass, she says he doesn't scare her, and if he wants her, he's gonna get her. We cut back to Rain's fight with the chair, which has her by the arms. Hannah and Wei Ming kick the door open to the Judgment Hall, and their sudden appearance distracts Rain long enough for the chair to impale her through the chest, killing her. Hannah is horrified to see this happen, but Yim Lao is baiting her to use her powers to undo it, even pouring more energy into her to help. Her eyes glow even brighter than before, and in a flash of light, we get a vision of the same fight, except this time Rain remains focused and the leg misses her. Then we cut back to the current moment where Rain jolts to life in Hannah's arms, the last time they met, them being in the opposite positions as Hannah died. They share a deep embrace, finally being together again. Yim Lao kills the mood by reminding them they're still in hell. He reiterates that he doesn't have free will like they do, so he can't release their friends, likening it to gravity, which can't decide to stop holding us down to the ground. As a god, he has to obey certain laws. But Hannah could use her eyes and free will to change his fate for him and give him free will. He wants to know what Rain saw when she sat on the chair and why it turned aggressive. Wei Ming tells her not to tell him, but he shuts her up by turning her into a paper doll again, something that seems to be a major weakness on her part. He continues to ponder about fate, stating that while mortals have free will, they can't see the consequences of their choices. Just like in the other games, there are a handful of different endings you could get. Now, I'm not entirely sure how these would be presented or what would affect which one you'd get, but in these materials, they've mapped out 4 different possibilities, with one of them clearly being the best. These might have just been the writers spitballing ideas, so it's possible not all of them were intended to be used, but I think they're all interesting. Each one kind of fleshes out the universe and addresses unanswered questions about the characters in their own way. In the worst choice, Rain accepts Yim Lao's request, telling him that the chair showed her a vision of what he wanted to achieve, and her resistance angered the chair. Yim Lao explains that as a demigod, she uniquely possesses the free will as a human to deny the fate it showed her, but also the strength of a god needed to overcome its influence. He continues, stating that humans manifest and strengthen their fate when they speak it into the world, which is often how we cripple ourselves with doubts and fears. And in some kind of logical paradox, by describing describing Yimlao's fate to him, no matter how vague, she spoke the idea of him having a fate in the first place into existence, therefore enabling Hana to change it with her eyes like he desires. This is an interesting concept because it isn't necessarily time travel. It feels like it is, but calling it fate makes it a more nebulous, ill-defined concept that gives them more room to play with. He implies here that the screw-up with the helicopter landing zone elevator was set up by him to sow doubt in her mind, so I guess that absolves Deke of some guilt. Niall had given the talismans to Mist, and now he has them, using them as a bargaining chip to force Hana into complying. Apparently she can't just use the power of her eyes anytime she wants, so he charges her up with energy to activate them. She uses her power on the chair, causing it a great deal of pain, and forcing it to release her teammates. At the same time, she does what Yimlao asks and grants him free will, causing an aura to begin radiating off of him. Rain helps the others get their talismans as they wake up from their trances, but Yimlao informs the others that Hana must stay with him in hell. Rain protests, but Hana stops her, and they share a final embrace, knowing this is the only way for the others to make it out alive. Everyone has one last group hug before they teleport back to Earth, leaving Hana alone in hell with Yimlao, who then explodes with power. The chair is torn to pieces and Mist's body is sent flying, with Yimlao proclaiming that he now has the free will to use his godly powers however he sees fit, which cannot be a good thing for the rest of the world. I'm guessing the credits would have started rolling here, urging you to see what you could have gotten with the other endings. In the better ending, when Rain goes to tell Yimlao what she saw in her vision, she instead describes him sitting down in the chair beside Mist and herself. This instantly sparks his imagination, making him realize that with the two women sharing the genes of their father, who he describes as the shaper of reality, he could channel that power through the chair into himself, far surpassing his scheme involving Hana. He offers to release the others, including Hana, if Rain stays and sits on the chair, which she reluctantly agrees to. Turns out it was all a trick from Rain, who has sacrificed herself to trap them all together, allowing Hana and the others to live freely on Earth. It ends with the chair exploding, either vaporizing them all or teleporting them to another dimension. In the third ending, Rain would simply lie and get called out for it by Yimlao. Surprisingly, they cut back to a scene from Retro Helix where Hana met an old version of herself who was subservient to him. He's implying that no matter how many times she's reincarnated as time repeats infinitely, she'll always be bound to him. While he can't force them to tell the truth, he says they have infinite lifetimes to see things his way. Then we'd see Hana sitting in the chair in the mansion, with Minx shooting her through the back once again, meaning everything was just gonna loop back to the same moment in the Judgment Hall eventually. You could possibly look at a second playthrough as being a direct continuation of this series of events where you finally set things right. The best ending of one was tied behind hard mode, so maybe they plan to do something like that again, where you needed to get this ending to get the final one. I've done far more insane things in games to get their obscure final endings, so this isn't out of the question. In the final ending, Rain would lie, but Yimlao would begin attacking her with blasts of energy. Unknown to him, her ring would collect some of it each time she was hit. Close to death, she redirects that energy into Hana to power her eyes, which she then uses to alter the fate of all of her teammates, teleporting them out of there, leaving Yimlao alone in the room. This would take us all the way back to the mansion chapter, with the characters having the foresight to stop the events they saw transpire. When Hana regains consciousness, it's at the moment where she's been captured, and Rain is being detained after being called out as a spy within Minx's harem. We see this from Hana's perspective in the other room, but this time she breaks free and knocks her captors out. A massive shootout ensues, with Minx taking Rain hostage, and Hana having trouble saving her in a sea of women dressed the same. You'd kick some ass and then make your way to the torture room we're all too familiar with. She blows open the door to see the roles reversed, with Rain now strapped to the chair she was shot in originally. Minx points his gun at Rain's head and taunts Hana by hinting that he had killed her parents all those years ago. His boasting makes him lose focus, and the second his gun moves away from Rain, Hana seizes the opportunity and puts a bullet in his forehead, in slow motion just like before. But this time, Hana doesn't have a similar bullet hole in her chest, and she takes out the other guards in the same breath. She She turns to the cyborg bodyguard who just watched this all happen and tells him he's out of a job. This would have led into another boss fight with him, which hopefully would have had some kind of switch up with it to make it satisfying as a final boss. Though there is a degree of nostalgia to the concept of fighting him again, since he was only at the start of the game and we've been on such a journey since then. The bodyguard has the upper hand, but Rain, using the power of the ring, bursts out of her chair, and we would have gotten to see what we only got a glimpse of during the first chapter and didn't have an explanation for. Her hair would be flowing as she levitated into the air, eyes white, filling the room with energy. Then she'd command all of that energy into the cyborg at once, causing him to explode. Cutting the tension, we'd then see Deacon Glass arguing about who should be the one to kick the door open to the torture room. When they enter, they're surprised to see the room completely demolished and filled with dead bodies. They run to help the ladies who are knocked out on the floor alongside the carnage. Hannah tells them they missed all the fun, which is a funny concept. Compared to the original standoff scene at the beginning of the game, the shoe is on the other foot. Throughout the game, these two guys went through hell, only for all of their work to be undone. With that, they once again speed down the mansion's driveway in a limo as the place explodes behind them. But this time, no one has a gaping chest wound. The camera would then distort in ripples as we pull back and reveal the scene was being watched by Yim Lao through a basin of water. Annoyed, he comments that he didn't expect her to use the eyes he gave her to alter her fate to such a degree, undoing his entire scheme. Then, from the shadows, another being would make his presence known, criticizing Yim Lao's tactics. He states that instead of attacking their minds, he needs to attack their hearts, suggesting the key to controlling the will of humans is by targeting what they desire most and giving it to them. His face would be revealed, with Yim Lao mockingly stating he doesn't know what to call him anymore because he's gone by so many names, whether it be Mephistopheles, Lucifer, or the Prince of Darkness. The script refers to him as the Western Devil, and this is basically a teaser for what could have been the antagonist of a fourth game. The story ends with the two of them sitting down for tea together, likely scheming on what they'd end up pulling off in a sequel. The idea that gods and devils from other cultures coexist in this world is really interesting, and greatly expands on the possibilities of what the series could tackle in the future. It wouldn't always have to be set in Hong Kong or revolve around Chinese mythology. It might seem like this character comes out of nowhere, but based on context clues throughout this whole journey, I'm gonna assume this was the mysterious figure making various appearances throughout the game, being referred to as just the Black Reaper in the script. So it was this guy hiding in the form of a dog at the start of the game, but was also in the waiting room of the hospital, was perhaps gonna appear to Glass at the beginning of the Shang-Chi level, and then would have helped him by giving him a gun once he made it to the City of the Dead. It's just confusingly written, since like I stated before, they also refer to the two Twin Reapers as the Black and White Reapers. But those guys seem to be working for Yim Lao whenever they appear. This guy appears to be undermining Yim Lao's plans, possibly because he wants to be the one to defeat the main characters in this theoretical sequel. Maybe that confusion was intended, and you were supposed to think this guy was one of the two Reapers working for Yim Lao, with the script attempting to preserve that surprise for the end as well. Either way, I think this is a great ending. The concept of looping back to the start of the game, undoing your critical mistake, shooting your killer in the face, and driving off into the sunset as everything explodes behind you is extremely satisfying after such an intense journey through hell. At the same time, it was enough of a pain in the ass for the characters with so many strings attached to it that it doesn't feel like it made death feel meaningless or easily undoable within the universe moving forward. But there is a lot I don't understand about the ending and what Yim Lao can and cannot do. Like, he says he can't change people's fate, yet he can actively attack them, potentially killing them himself. It's just hard to wrap my head around the materials I have here, though I'm sure this stuff would have been explored more had the game actually been finished. Then there were little threads that didn't seem to go anywhere. What was with Deke's clothes disappearing piece by piece as he committed more sins? His whole storyline didn't have a satisfying conclusion here, when it felt like it was building up to something good with how much he was made to suffer and reflect on his past. Instead, he just continued to do terrible things, some of which weren't even portrayed in a fun or endearing way, and never did anything to get redeemed. I could see him being really disliked even by players who completed the game. I really like that Rain and her powers are explored more throughout the game and factor into the climax. She's one of those stranger elements that makes the core concept of Fear Effect unique. Plus, seeing her twin sister Mist get to take a more active role as a villain was nice to see too. I wonder where all of that optional romance stuff was meant to lead, and whether it was intended to affect which ending you ended up getting. These choices seem to only exist in the first half of the game, but I imagine they would have implemented more if they had the chance. The game seemed to be inconsistently paced when it came to actual gun-based combat encounters, and I wonder how that aspect of the game's design would have been tweaked further along or received by the general public. One of the last things worth mentioning would be what looked like a wave-based survival mode. You can access it in this beta by selecting Arena as the chapter you want to play. The criteria for winning wasn't implemented, but if this was in the final game, it could definitely be a place to go for your fix of shootouts. It's extremely disappointing that this game wasn't able to be completed and released. While they were still ironing out the pieces later into its story, what's here shows a great deal of promise. The sequence of events, locations, and twisted visuals are all engrossing, rising to the level of quality of the first game with the potential of surpassing it. The expanded movesets of the characters would have elevated the gameplay significantly, and these fast-paced, extravagant animations could have made the game iconic. Each chapter had its own vibe associated with it, giving the experience an eclectic feel. Shootouts with gangsters, followed by melee-focused psychological horror, then the spirit-filled ruins of a previous game, and finally a grandiose city filled to the brim with irreverent chaos. All before coming full circle with its explosive ending, tying a bow on what would have been a tight package. Usually, when a sequel goes in a more fast-paced action direction, it becomes more lighthearted overall. But here, they were cranking up the dial with its action and horror elements simultaneously, creating a unique beast. Obviously, I don't know the details of how things actually went down, but it just doesn't make sense to me why their publisher would look at this and back out of the project, dooming the game to cancellation. These days, it's become all too common for developers to get axed without any rhyme or reason, regardless of whether they're successful or not. So it's easy to just accept that there might not have been a satisfying reason for why this choice was made in the case of Chronos Digital Entertainment, especially when it hasn't been unearthed over 20 years after the company dissolved. I'm still holding out hopes that we'll eventually see a true revival of this series, or at the very least, maybe recounting all of this today could inspire some of you out there to pursue something creative in a similar vein. This was a long video, but it was all in service of painting a picture of what the team at Chronos intended for this game to be and what we missed out on, considering it appeared they were already setting up for what they wanted to do with the series even further down the line. Give the beta a try if this topic has interested you, and enjoy a chance to relive a bygone era of gaming.